On the south side of Chicago was once a historic baseball field so vital to American culture that it birthed trends that became famous nationwide. Yet, despite its prevalence as a venue where generations of fathers and sons connected over the American pastime of baseball, it has since been demolished and replaced by a comparatively soulless corporate imitation. But why? Why did Chicago tear down its so-called baseball palace of the world? Well, stay tuned to find out, because today we discover the rise and fall of Comiskey Park. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Most of us are familiar with the Chicago White Sox and their old stadium. However, few of us realize that the park was built as a successor to a previous Chicago ballpark, the South Side Park. There were actually 3 different baseball parks in Chicago known as South Side Park. The first South Side Park was known as Union Baseball Park, or the 39th Street grounds. This park was home to the Chicago Browns during their entry into the 1884 Union Association, a Major League Baseball league that only lasted that season. To the best of our research, there are no photos or drawings of the 39th Street grounds, nor is it found on any maps or directories. There are very few written records about the park, so its boundaries are rather unclear. The 39th Street grounds stopped being used after the Union Association left Chicago. The second Southside Park was at 35th and Wentworth and served as the home of the Chicago Pirates during the Players League in 1890. Then later became home to the Chicago Cubs from 1891 to 1893. The second Southside Park was called the Brotherhood Park in the local newspapers, and the reasons the Cubs abandoned this park in 1893 is rather peculiar. You see, the Cubs wanted to play games on Sundays, but were not allowed to do so according to the Southside lease, so they picked up and moved west instead. Brotherhood Park's land was eventually bought and turned into Comiskey Park. The third Southside Park operated for the longest time and was the best known of the 3. It was here that Charles Comiskey built a wooden grandstand on the site in 1900, a move which marked the beginning of Southside Park's time as the home base for the Chicago White Sox. With a seating capacity of 15,000, it served as the White Sox home from 1900 to 1910, when they moved to their newly completed Comiskey Park during the middle of the 1910 season. Comiskey Park was built by Charles Comiskey in 1909. Charles Comiskey is a famous figure in American baseball, having served as an influential player, manager, and team owner, sometimes serving all functions at once. Baseball fans gave him the nickname the Old Roman. Anyhow, Comiskey started playing baseball in the 1882 American Association as a St. Louis Browns Stockings member. He took over the team as team manager in 1885. Comiskey also served as player and manager of the Chicago Pirates in the Players League and the Cincinnati Reds in the National League. From there, he bought the Western League team in Sioux City in 1894, the Cornhuskers, which he then moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and renamed the St. Paul Saints. They played there as a part of the Western League for a few years, until in 1900 when the St. Paul Saints moved to the south side of Chicago as a part of the American League with their newly christened team name, the White Stockings, later shortened to the White Sox to look better in newspaper headlines. After moving to Chicago, the White Sox settled into the third Southside Park as their new home base, but that wasn't the original plan. You see, originally, Comiskey had planned on using Brotherhood Park, his team's home field, while managing the Browns. However, Brotherhood Park had long since been torn down, forcing a last-minute switch to the Southside Park. Surprisingly, Southside Park was always meant to be nothing more than a temporary home for the White Sox. The 15,000 seating capacity was too small for Comiskey's tastes, and the fact that the grand structures were all wooden meant that there was a serious risk of fire, which happened briefly in 1909. Comiskey repeatedly announced his plans to build a permanent park for the White Sox, and assured it would happen as soon as he could afford paying both the land and construction expenses. He finally did it in 1910. Architect Zachary Taylor Davis designed Comiskey Park with input from Comiskey and Hall of Fame pitcher Ed Walsh. Zachary Davis is a notable figure in baseball history as well, as he would go on to design several other ballparks, including nearby Wrigley Field, just 4 years later. And while we're on the topic, I'm considering doing a video on that ballpark, but I don't know if we have any Cubs fans watching, so hit the subscribe button to let me know if I should make that video. Anyhow, the design of Comiskey Park was very modern for the time. Unlike the previous base, Comiskey Park was made of steel and concrete, the third major league field to be built like that. Upon opening, it was nicknamed the Baseball Palace of the World. Comiskey Park had a beautiful red brick facade on its outside and was built on 15 acres of land. It was built on landfill that Comiskey purchased from the city. Before then, it had been a part of Brotherhood Park, the initial intended home for the White Sox. Comiskey Park had a seating capacity of 32,000, a two-tier grandstand, and wooden bleachers behind the outfield wall. It was also fireproof. The dimensions, both left and right field, were both 362 feet, and the distance to the center field fence was 420 feet. The design and dimensions of the playing field favored pitchers, as per Comiskey's request. When brainstorming the plan for the ballpark, Davis and Walsh visited the other steel and concrete parks to study them for inspiration. Walsh, as a pitcher, prioritized how the fields could create conditions favorable for pitchers. Davis, following the tour, took a liking to the arches like the one at Pittsburgh's Forbes Field, and hence included touches of Romanesque arches in Comiskey Park's final design. And he wanted to take the notions much further and proposed several very sophisticated concepts to Comiskey, but all of them were vetoed to cut down on costs. The construction of the park only took 5 months. It opened as White Sox Park on July 1st, 1910. Comiskey Park had a terrible reputation for hitting conditions, and this was well documented. The field consistently saw low scores or poor hitting records. Because of how the area was designed, playing offense was difficult. During the first half season played at the park, there were a total of 51 games played. And during those 51 games, the White Sox and their opponents combined only hit a .203 average. There were also only 3 home runs, both of which were the ground rule type and not the classic out-of-the-park type. There were some exciting moments as well, such as an all-out pitcher's duel between Ed Walsh of the White Sox and Jack Coombs of the Philadelphia Athletics. It went on with no scores for 16 innings. Coombs set a record for the number of batters struck out that was not beaten until 1976. In the park's first decade, out of 105 home run hits, 62 were inside the field. Throughout the entire history of baseball, Comiskey Park is unique in that it is the only ballpark where no batter has ever hit 100 home runs. The White Sox performed exceptionally well during their first decade in business. During their first 7 seasons, Comiskey Park was the most attended baseball field in the American League. It hosted the World Series from 1917 to 1919. The White Sox played 2 of them. The popularity of Comiskey Park affected the neighborhood as well. The park was perhaps appropriately located in a predominantly working-class area with a very large Irish demographic. Because of this, the green cornerstone was laid in the park during construction on St. Patrick's Day. The first 5 years it was open saw a steep rise in real estate prices, but also brought new opportunities and amenities, such as a local pub called McCuddy's Tavern. The pub catered to visitors of Comiskey Park and was frequented by baseball legend Babe Ruth, who often played at the stadium. The bar featured a bat with his signature until it was eventually torn down in 1988. There was also an exclusive club underneath the grandstand called the Bard's Room, which was occasionally used by the White Sox to meet with the press. And it would be here that the Chicago White Sox faced some rather challenging PR. The White Sox, and especially Comiskey, took a big hit to their reputations in 1920 due to the event typically known as the Black Sox Scandal. In the 1919 World Series, 8 players were paid off. They were paid $10,000 to throw the championship to the Cincinnati Reds. This prompted lots of scrutiny from Comiskey's wage practices. The players were severely underpaid, even by league standards, which were already relatively low. The players even had to pay to wash their own uniforms. So 10 grand to throw a game was actually a very good offer. Most players at the time had little to no say in their salaries until the flashback, as the otherwise best circumstance would simply be that Comiskey would promise to pay bonuses to players and then wait to deliver. In the aftermath of the trial, the guilty White Sox players were banned from playing, ruining the team's lineup and ending their league domination. Despite this, Comiskey Park was being expanded. The only significant change before the 1920s had been to expand the bleachers and raise the seating capacity to 41,000. In other words, the White Sox were still very popular, and hence Comiskey Park needed more room for the crowds. Expansion was due. The 1920s generally featured a baseball popularity boom, and while the Chicago economy itself expanded, so would its ballpark. Comiskey Park's 1926 to 1927 expansion was overseen by the original architect, Davis. The ballpark's capacity was nearly doubled. The grandstand was extended all the way around the field, with the only open bit left being a single level of bleachers behind center field. More land was purchased to expand the right field properly. The seats and aisles were widened, and the outfield walls were raised. The entire park stayed symmetrical looking, which was rare among ballparks of the era, but there were also some concessions made. Because the bleachers were now double-decked, hand-operated scoreboards were inserted into the outfield walls, and this presented a new challenge for sluggers. Comiskey Park's outfield stands were now 70 feet tall, so the goal of playing batters was to try and hit a home run over the roof. The first one to do it was Babe Ruth. As a part of the expansion, the field was made even larger. Hitting home runs were now even harder. Now, hitting a home run out of Comiskey Park was an achievement to set exceptional batters apart. The 1927 design was the largest Comiskey Park would ever be, and the 1920 expansion was the only major expansion the park ever really had. The large field design also made Comiskey Park a good setting for football, and it was exploited as such. For example, the ballpark spent a long time as the home of the now mostly forgotten Chicago Cardinals. Charles Comiskey passed away in 1931. He died just after the White Sox had completed their 11th straight year in the bottom half of the American League. After his passing, ownership of the Sox and Comiskey Park went to his son, Lou Comiskey, who wanted to honor his father's legacy, and hence Lou helped make the team more competitive again. But Lou was also innovative, as he had lights installed in 1939, meaning the first night game in Chicago was played at Comiskey Park. On August the 14th, 1939, the match was between the White Sox and the St. Louis Browns. The White Sox won 5-2. Sadly, however, Lou didn't get to see this historic event, having died a few weeks beforehand. This would also mark the moment that the park would drift away from family control. Lou had left the ownership of the White Sox to the First National Bank of Chicago because he expected them to give it to his wife, Grace, so she could pass it along to their son Chuck when he was older. Instead, the bank tried to sell to a third party. Grace sued them for breaking their word, won, and became the second woman to own a team in the Major League. Grace introduced a series of minor improvements. She added newer, better seats, more concessions, more toilets, and better press boxes. Grace also added a giant center field scoreboard in 1950, and she wasn't even close to being finished. In fact, she had a $500,000 4-year improvement plan in the works for Comiskey Park that only ended upon her death in 1956. Her son Chuck had expected to inherit ownership from the team when she died and was surprised when instead it went to Grace's daughter, Dorothy, who had a husband already working a top job in the group. Chuck spent a few years in a futile legal battle to try and seize custody, but failed each time. Dorothy offered to sell her stock to Chuck in 1959, but was insulted by the terrible price he offered, so ultimately, she sold to Bill Veeck instead. Veeck had owned a few other baseball teams previously. During those times, he had gained something of a reputation for adventure and experimentation. Veeck was known to promote his ventures in a significant and unpredictable way, consistently. Veeck tried several gimmicks to promote Comiskey Park. Turning the brick facade completely white, he added a picnic area under the left field bleachers where visitors could watch the game through gaps in the outfield wall. This move was a hit with baseball fans, so he added a matching location under the right field bleachers later. I just wonder how that worked in practicality. I imagine that beer, wrappers, and food scraps would fall through those same gaps and onto the people having a picnic below. Anyhow, the most significant, most famous change that Veeck introduced to Comiskey Park was the exploding scoreboard. He revamped the center field scoreboard that Grace Comiskey had installed and added a pinwheel, fireworks, and speakers. The gimmick was that the scoreboard would set off a fireworks display every time a Sox player hit a home run. There were even different sound effects for various events and games. The exploding scoreboard was a big hit with Comiskey Park fans. However, critics thoroughly mocked the attraction as being a total joke and insult to serious baseball. Veeck discovered he had a brain tumor and decided to sell his shares so that he could focus on health. Hence, the ownership of Comiskey Park passed to Arthur Allen, a local businessman. He renamed Comiskey Park back to White Sox Park after the purchase. However, all the newspapers continued to refer to it as Comiskey Park. But that was probably the least of his worries. Allen's ownership could have gone much better. He announced many projects to spruce up the park and revitalize attendance, and every single one fell through. Actually, the only successful measures was replacing the infield grass with artificial turf and having the exploding scoreboard cut down for maintenance costs. By 1970, Comiskey Park was the oldest ballpark in the major leagues still open, and it showed. As a result, attendance had fallen off, and business was dying. Disturbed by the decline, after he recovered from his health issues, Veeck repurchased the park for a second go. He changed the official name back to Comiskey Park, ripped up the infield turf, and replanted the grass. He restarted that famous exploding scoreboard and installed a shower for fans to cool off. He also hired a female organist named Nancy Faust, who taunted the losing teams with "na na na na, hey hey, goodbye." I'm sure you've heard that. A trend that became popular nationwide. Then, Harry Carey began the tradition of singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" in the 17th inning. He later took that to the Cubs at Wrigley Field, where it became better known. But none of these other attempts at boosting popularity can compare with the significant promotional event in 1979, Disco Demolition Night. Disco Demolition Night was designed to feed into anti-disco sentiment in the late 1970s. During the event, fans brought disco records, put them in the middle of the field between games, and blew them up. The event was way more popular than Veeck expected, quickly getting out of hand. You see, after blowing up the records, the crowd lost control and stormed out onto the field. They accidentally ripped out much of the turf. They forced the White Sox into an automatic forfeit in their second game of the night against the Detroit Tigers. And perhaps this was the golden age of Comiskey Park. And it was also the time that Bill Veeck sold ownership of the park to Jerry Reinsdorf in 1981. Reinsdorf initially sank $14 million into renovating and updating Comiskey Park. He then looked into fully renovating the ballpark, but found it to be not worthwhile. In 1988, Reinsdorf announced that he would be closing down the park and moving the White Sox to St. Petersburg, Florida, if he did not get the funding from Chicago to build a new field. On June the 30th, 1988, the Illinois state legislature just barely made a midnight deadline to pass a bill on financing the new field. In other words, the demolition of the historical park was imminent. Comiskey Park's 81st and final year was one to remember, with two players setting world records and the team hitting more home runs than ever. Comiskey Park held its final game on September the 30th, 1990. After the White Sox won, Nancy Faust said goodbye with a special rendition of Auld Lang Syne, followed by her classic, "Na Na, Hey Hey, Goodbye." Comiskey Park was demolished in the summer of 1991, and the site was turned into a parking lot for the new Comiskey Park, which opened on April the 19th, 1991. And just like its predecessor, the new park has an exploding scoreboard, an old-time facade with Romanesque arches, and 40,000 seats with unobstructed views. Over 2 million fans attended in the first year of the park alone. The new Comiskey Park was renamed U.S. Cellular Field in 2003, and then again in 2016 to Guaranteed Rate Field. When it first opened, the park faced complaints that the upper deck was too tall and looked bland and generic from the outside. Guaranteed Rate Field has had many renovations since 2001 to fix these issues, and perhaps most would feel that it's worthy of its successor as a replacement. And it's at this point that I'd like to backpedal to my opinions at the top of the video, the ones about this being a corporate imitation. It might be the fact that my family are Cubs fans, or it might be the fact that the park no longer has their so-called disco demolition nights. Or maybe, just maybe, Guaranteed Rate Field leaves a little bit too much to the imagination. The name, Guaranteed Rate Field, sounds more like a place where you'd sign yourself into debt than it does a place where you can forget about your debts. My own father was about as American as you can be, and he once told me that ballparks are a place to forget about reality for a while. Even though the original field is long gone, there's still many remnants. You just need to know where to look. First off, we have the original home plate from Comiskey Park, which is now on display at the Chicago Sports Depot, which is a sports memorabilia store located adjacent to Guaranteed Rate Field, the current home of the Chicago White Sox. There are also the original bases used in Comiskey Park, which have also been preserved. One base is on display at the Chicago Sports Depot as well, with the other being found at the Illinois Sports Hall of Fame in Chicago. A decorative archway from the old stadium's entrance gate is outside of Guaranteed Rate Field, and it serves as a tribute to the history and legacy of Comiskey Park. Then we have the two bronze sculptures depicting legendary White Sox players. These were initially located inside the park, but after demolition, they were relocated and can now be seen near the entrance of Guaranteed Rate Field. There are also various plaques and historical markers which have been placed around the area where Comiskey Park once stood. These markers provide information about the history of the stadium and its significance in Chicago sports. Comiskey Park has been home to some of the most legendary moments in baseball history, and thanks to that high roof we discussed earlier, it was also site to some of the longest home runs ever recorded. So it's safe to say that this stadium remained an unchanged bastion of America's favorite sport for 80 years. This historic accolade was its main selling point. It's also what doomed it. Next to newer, more impressive stadiums, this park became yesterday's news. And well, indeed, it might be gone, it will never be forgotten. Perhaps more importantly is that Chicago has preserved Wrigley Field, one of America's last true ballparks. And if you'd like me to make a video on that episode, click right here to subscribe. And don't miss our episode on Chicago's forgotten stockyards by clicking here. Until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.